What kind of content is in your public library? Should you be concerned? That's the focus of today's Faith and Culture. Stick with us. Welcome to this week's episode of Faith and Culture. I'm your host, Trey Gons Phillips, and I'm joined today by Pastor John Amanchukwu. Pastor, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on, Trey.
Well, it's good to have you here on Faith and Culture. And look, I'm going to dive right in. You may have heard that there are churchgoers in Louisville, Kentucky, who recently went into a public library in a neighboring county where they checked out and are now refusing to return children's books that they deemed were sexually perverse. I believe it was 16 book titles in total that are centering on LGBT identities, sexually explicit content. What's your immediate reaction to something like that? Certainly an unorthodox way of addressing it. Let's go in and take these books and then just not return them.
My initial response is, where do I send a donation to help this continue? All right. How do I help fund this mission? You know, respectfully, I don't think that any school should have books that seek to indoctrinate children into heterosexuality or into homosexuality, into transgenderism, into bestiality, and all of these other isms and schisms of our culture. I don't think that should be the focus of education. You know, we should teach students how to think, not simply what to think. That's what we should teach kids. But however, I'm steeped in this topic. I've now traveled to 21 states, speaking up for kids, fighting against filth. You know, some people call it indoctrination, but I like to call it mental rape because it assaults the soul, it stains the brain, and it robs kids of their innocence. This book right here that I'm holding up is entitled Worm Loves Worm by J.J. Austrian and Mike Curato. This book is for kids ages 4 and up. And the focus of this book is that it talks about same-sex marriage. You know, there are two worms in this book that ultimately end up getting married. One of the pages says, "But which one of you is the bride? Ask the bees. And how can we be bridesmaids if we don't know who the bride is?" And then one of the worms says, "I can be the bride," says worm, and the other worm says, "I can too," says worm. And so both of the worms are going to be the bride, and then both of the worms are going to be the groom. And then the worms seek to get married. And so they ask Cricket in this book, the preacher, Cricket, the preacher, to marry them. And it says, "Wait," says Cricket, "this isn't how it's always been done." And then the worms say, "Then we'll just change how it's done," says worm. "Yes," says worm. And so this book is for kids ages 4 and up, and it pushes same-sex marriage on them. Now, just because the Supreme Court has made it legal for 2 men and 2 women to get married, it doesn't make it right. Heaven doesn't endorse the marital bond between 2 men and 2 women. But this has been the movement afoot in the American education system. And it's why even I launched my YouTube channel. You can go to John Amanchukwu to find out more about the episodes that I do on this same issue. You can go to John Amanchukwu as well on YouTube and see my documentary that details my national campaign on how to bring common sense back to education and to reclaim schools and communities.
You know, I want to talk, John, about what motivated you to get into this fight. But first, I want to ask you, how do you think we got to this place as a culture to begin with, where we're, sending our kids to schools and to libraries where they can check out books that are like this?
Well, Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter." When you start calling same-sex marriage and transgenderism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even critical race theory good, That's where this comes from. But there's been a movement afoot by Marxist atheists for a long time to deconstruct Christianity and to push this ideology upon kids. Alice Bailey has been one of the main propagators of this content and information through her plan to create a society where Christ was dethroned. People like her and many others, but that's where this comes from. It also comes from the weakening of the Christian church. When only 36% of senior pastors have a biblical worldview, and only 13% of teaching pastors have a biblical worldview, and only 12% of youth pastors have a biblical worldview, you're going to have a problem. And so in the Christian church today, we have people talking about God and preaching from the Bible that don't trust and or believe God in how they should carry out their everyday lives. I believe this, Trey, that weak pulpits create weak Christians. Weak pulpits create weak Christians. Weak shepherds create weak sheep. And that's what we're contending with today, and I think that now more than ever, we need to have a come to Jesus meeting around the significance and the inerrancy and the infallibility of the Word of God. We need preachers to get back to believing the Word of God from Genesis to Revelations and to preaching the whole counsel of God's truth.
So what then was it that motivated you? Why is this something that you are passionate about? Like you said at the start, you've gone to 21 states and you've spoken out against the books that are in libraries and in classrooms that the teachers are pushing on kids, librarians are exposing kids to. Why is this something that you personally care about?
Well, first and foremost, as a father, I care. Men are called to be protectors, to be providers and the priest of their home. But then also, I'm a Christian and I'm also a pastor. I'm a preacher. I'm an evangelist. I don't only care about John Patrick, my oldest son, and Pamela, the middle child, my daughter, and John Jr., my youngest. I don't only care about them. I care about the students that they will see in society, the people that they will come up around. Now, my kids are blessed to go to a private Christian school where they are in what I call a greenhouse that has allowed them to really keep out a lot of the intentional indoctrination of these ideologies. But I want my kids to grow up in a society where we can suppress the onslaught of the Marxist atheist agenda. And so when I was asked 3 years ago to go to a school board meeting and to speak up for a young girl that was being demonized for her Christian faith, I took it. That opportunity. I grabbed the bull by the horns. And I'm glad that I went because the message ended up going viral. I didn't think that a 180-second message for 3 minutes, my friends, would catapult my ministry and take me to the level that God has ordained me to be in this moment. I would have never thought that traveling to 21 states and in some instances speaking for even 2 minutes or 1 minute would be the catapulting thing to get the message out about the significance of reclaiming schools and communities. I want to say to those who are listening that you never know when that opportunity for God to use you is going to come, but be sure to take it because it might come packaged as an offer from a person who's working with Moms for Liberty to go to a school board meeting. When that time comes, make sure you say yes to God.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we're going to fit in a quick break, but we have so much more to talk about on the other side. So everybody stick with us. Well, welcome back to Faith and Culture. We are sitting down with Pastor John Emanchukwu. Pastor, from a biblical and ministerial perspective, How do you think Christians should thoughtfully respond to these kinds of objectionable things being infused into our public institutions like our schools and like our libraries? Because I think sometimes we can feel uh, we feel kind of on a fence, right? I don't want to be too compassionate and sacrifice truth, and I don't want to be so truthful that I'm too blunt and I'm beating people over the head.
Sure. The Bible tells us in the book of Proverbs 14, it says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach towards any people. If we really want to make America great again, it's not solely going to come from a balanced budget and reducing inflation, even though we want to do those things. It's not going to solely come from reducing taxes and securing the border, which we want to do that as well. But it's going to come from mitigating sin and putting God first in our culture. And if there's any way or any place that we should be doing that at the most, it should be in education and how we prepare our children and how we catechize them and how we put an emphasis on pedagogy. But that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where we've been fought the most. And so my efforts have been solely to bring about spiritual renewal by calling people to repentance for the fact that we have created a society where kids can go to school and transition unbeknownst to their parents. We have some school systems where kids in America can go and have an abortion and their parents don't know it. We have some kids who go to musicals and plays and they use a name that their parents didn't give them. And their parents go to the musical and the play and they notice that they never hear Johnny's name, but they hear Jane, not knowing that Jane is the persona of Johnny at school, because the school system has created a separate and alternative lifestyle for that student intentionally. My response to that is God forbid. There are three types of people when it comes to this issue of exploitation of minors. You have punks, you have perverts, and you have protectors, right? Pick your P. The punks represent God's message in Revelations to the cowards who will be thrown into the lake of fire for not holding to God's truth. And then you have perverts these are adults who sit on school boards, who are superintendents, who are activist teachers, who are pushing their own lasciviousness upon kids. And then you have protectors, right? And the protectors are the men just like me and you who see this great injustice and they respond in the same way that David responded when the giant Goliath was trying to demonize those who trusted in God. And so now more than ever, we need protectors to speak up. We have the punks, we have the perverts, but in the kingdom, we need protectors. Now, there's a difference. There's a difference here. There's a difference between being a nice Christian and being a faithful Christian. The nice Christian sees evil and they whisper a cute prayer and they turn the other way and they keep going about their business. But the faithful Christian stops and they address the problem themselves. They speak up. They put their neck on the line. They risk their own upward mobility. Do you not know that as a result of my national campaign, I have been in some areas canceled? I have lost speaking engagements. I've received all of the hate speech towards me that you can even conjure up or imagine. I've been attacked in many ways. I've been called a white supremacist because I defended kids across this nation. I've seen it all. But this is the role of the protector. We don't tuck tail and run when danger comes. We don't take the position of being a nice Christian versus being a faithful Christian. Because what we're going to hear from God if we make it to heaven, is a well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. And that is what my movement is about. And that's what we stand for.
Often change isn't going to happen until some sort of disruption has occurred, which is a lot of the kind of work that you do. So what's the line between personal conviction and when that should spill into some form of civil disobedience?
Well, speaking of civil disobedience, I mean, we saw civil disobedience in the Old Testament. When Elijah went to King Ahab and told him that there will be no dew nor rain until he said so, do you not know that that was civil disobedience? He was supposed to have his head removed from his shoulders, but he did it anyway. When the Hebrew boys said, no, we're not going to bow to the music and worship a false god. That was civil disobedience that landed them into a fiery furnace. When Daniel did the same thing and was thrown into the lion's den, it was because of civil disobedience. If there's anything that the Christian church needs today, is we do need civil disobedience. We need the ability to understand the full essence of Romans 13. The powers that be are ordained by God, but we're not called to walk through this life blindly, bowing to the Nebuchadnezzars of our day and the King Cyruses of our day, right? We are called to uphold God's truth. And so there's a point where we draw a line in the sand and we respectfully turn the world right side up. They said that Paul was turning the world upside down. No, he wasn't. He was really turning it right side up because the culture had turned it upside down. And so I have been handcuffed after speaking at a school board meeting because of civil disobedience. I've been kicked out of 6 school board meetings around this nation. I've been threatened by law enforcement. I had a citywide emergency called on me, Trey, because I went to Baltimore to speak at a school board meeting and they called a citywide emergency. Just consider all of the crime in Baltimore, right? Baltimore is leading in homicides and crime and carjackings. But when the Christian conservative pastor showed up to speak at the school board meeting, they called a citywide emergency on me. Civil disobedience is necessary and more Christians need to do it.
There are some who would say, let's reform the systems that exist. People who think Christians should fill roles in public spaces to fix them. They should take up space in school board meetings like you have and speak out against these issues. And then there are others who would say, let's just abandon the public square altogether. It's not worth it. Let's just kind of watch that burn and create our own spaces. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I think politics is very much so a great deal of the Bible, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it is. I do think that the Great Commission causes us and constrains us to have a focus be applied to modern day politics. We can't abandon the culture. We can't abandon politics. We need to pray for the peace of America, for the peace of the city. Because we will be impacted by whether or not there's peace or chaos. And so for the Christian to say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to touch the political realm at all. I mean, you've already lost the battle. The government is supposed to be upon the Lord's shoulder. And we are his change agents that have been left on this earth. And so we have to engage in politics. We have to speak truth to power, but we ultimately have to know that our focus is not solely to point people to the left or to the right, but towards the cross.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, there is a lot more that we want to get to in the last few minutes of our conversation with Pastor John, but we're going to fit in one more quick break. Everybody stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Faith and Culture. We're joined by Pastor John Umunchukwu. Pastor, we've talked about a lot of the issues that we face in our culture, and there certainly are many and things that need to be addressed, things that we need to raise our voices about. But there's also a lot to be encouraged by. So what stories in your time traveling around the country have inspired you, and why are you hopeful about the future?
Well, to know that we have been able to remove hundreds of pornographic books through my organization, iknowgod.us, that's inspiring and encouraging. To know that we've been able to strike down transgender policies and help flip school board meetings and raise up other ministries that are now doing the same thing that I'm doing. That really gives me a great hope and solace, and it reminds me that the work that God has called me to do for these past 3 years isn't in vain. And so I'm inspired and hopeful for the future. I do see that revival is coming to the American education system. I do think that tone from the top, and having a president who day one said that he will make sure that only 2 sexes are recognized, and the dismantling of the federal education system, which puts the focus and the impetus upon local municipalities and school systems to do what's best for kids, is the best thing for America. There is a lot of hope there. And as I move forward with the master class that I'm going to release here soon on my YouTube channel, John Amanchukwu, it's imperative that more people embrace the opportunities that we have to fight as boots on the ground from the bottom up.
Yeah. For people who want to get involved in the work that you're doing or want to check out some of your content, you mentioned a masterclass that you're working on. You're also an author and a podcaster. For people who want to check out some of that content, where can they go?
Go to John Amanchukwu on YouTube to find more of the content, and then go to iknowgod.us to find out more about my ministry and how we can reclaim schools and communities.
Well, Pastor John Amanchukwu, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time.
God bless you. Thank you so much, Trey.
All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode of Faith and Culture. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith and Culture. Thank you so much for being here with us. If you want more of our conversation with Pastor John Amanchukwu, check out our Faith and Culture podcast. It'll be available this week, a new episode. And also, as always, go to cbnnews.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Thank you so much, and God bless you.